A veteran sought refuge in the mountains after the world he knew fell apart. With only his loyal dog and the weight of silence as company, he inherited a cabin from his grandmother, far from everything he once knew. He didn't come to start over. He came to disappear. But his dog,
Keep your
Max,
eyes on him.
began sensing things long
down,
before
stay.
Caleb could see
Don't let
them.
him see you move.
Things hidden in the forest, things that shouldn't be there. In the harsh
see him.
winter, a stranger
low.
appeared on the ridge, bringing with him a story of strange happenings and things better left undisturbed.
Growl.
What Caleb thought was isolation soon became something
Not alone out
more,
here.
something darker,
They're here.
something that would change everything. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if this story pulls you in, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Caleb Brooks' fingers tightened around the steering wheel as the car bumped along the narrow, snow-covered road. The tire tracks were barely visible beneath a fresh layer of powder, and the ever-present mountains rose like silent giants around him. The wind whipped fiercely outside, carrying with it the scent of pine and cold earth. But inside the car, it was quiet. Too quiet. Just the hum of the engine and the soft breathing of his companion, Max, beside him. Max, his German shepherd, was curled up in the passenger seat, his amber eyes flickering briefly toward Caleb before returning to the road ahead. Caleb had always admired how the dog seemed to sense things Caleb couldn't quite put into words. Max had been by his side for years, through both the battlefield and the lonely nights that followed, after everything had fallen apart. Caleb had left the military after 2 decades of service. He had expected a smooth transition, maybe even a feeling of relief. But there was only silence. The war had taken its toll, on him, on his mind, on his marriage. When Sarah had left, there was no drama, no confrontation. Just a note, folded neatly on the kitchen counter. I can't live with someone who's always ready to disappear. Caleb had folded it back, not tearing it, just putting it away. No need for words when the silence already spoke volumes. Now he was here, in a cabin deep in the Wyoming mountains, an inheritance from his grandmother. It was meant to be his escape, a place to disappear from the world. No more memories, no more reminders of the man he used to be. Just the quiet, the cold, and Max. The car crept up the winding road, its tires struggling to maintain traction as they climbed higher. Caleb's breath caught slightly as he saw the small cabin appear through the trees. The roof was steep, built to shed the heavy snow that had already begun to accumulate. The cabin was dark, silent, as if it had been waiting for him. He parked the car beside the weathered wood structure and turned off the engine, the silence almost deafening in contrast to the noise of the journey. Max didn't move at first. He stayed perfectly still, his head tilted as if listening for something Caleb couldn't hear. Caleb opened the door, the cold air rushing in like a physical force, and stepped out, his boots crunching in the snow. Max followed closely behind him, his paws sinking into the snow as he moved with a grace that belied his size. The cabin stood at the edge of a frozen creek, surrounded by tall pines. Snow drifted down, covering the landscape in a blanket of white. It was beautiful, in a cold, remote way. Caleb stood there for a moment, taking it all in. He had never been one for the quiet life, but something about the solitude of the mountains called to him. It was as if the weight of the world could be left behind here, if only for a while. Max moved around the cabin, his nose to the ground as he sniffed the air. Caleb watched him, his mind still heavy with the weight of everything that had brought him here. The cabin felt like a tomb, the silence overwhelming, yet oddly comforting. He wondered if it would ever feel like home. The door creaked as Caleb pushed it open. The cold air followed him inside, mixing with the stale, musty scent of a place that had been abandoned for far too long. It was dark inside, the only light coming from the faint glow of the dying daylight outside. Caleb let out a slow breath, his boots scraping against the wooden floor as he moved through the room. Max entered behind him, his body tense as he moved deeper into the cabin. Caleb took note of the small details: the old stone hearth, the heavy wooden beams above him, the dust that had settled on the furniture. The cabin was bare, save for the essentials. It was exactly what Caleb had expected. A place to escape, a place to disappear. But something felt off. Caleb couldn't put his finger on it, but the air was different here, heavier somehow. Max had stopped at the entrance, his body frozen in place. Caleb turned, following the dog's gaze. There was nothing. No movement, no sounds, just the heavy silence of the cabin settling around them. Yet Max's posture remained stiff, as if something had caught his attention. "Easy, boy," Caleb murmured, but Max didn't move. Caleb's heart began to beat faster. The dog wasn't afraid, not in the way he had been before. It was more like recognition. Caleb's breath hitched as he approached Max, standing beside him. The dog was still, his amber eyes fixed on the door. "What's out there?" Caleb whispered. Max's ears twitched and his tail flicked once, a sign that he was on alert. Caleb didn't know what to make of it. There was nothing out there, nothing visible, nothing that should have been threatening. But the air felt thick, charged, as though it were waiting for something. He stepped forward, his boots creaking on the old wood, and pulled open the door. The wind rushed in immediately, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and cold. Caleb stood there for a moment, looking out into the white abyss, but the landscape was still, no movement, no sign of life. Max stepped forward cautiously, sniffing the ground, his body low to the earth. Caleb followed behind him, his boots crunching in the snow, but there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary, nothing that would have caused Max's sudden unease. "Come on, boy," Caleb said, his voice low and reassuring. But Max stopped again, his head tilting to the side as if he heard something Caleb couldn't. There was a rustling sound in the trees, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't the wind. Caleb's pulse quickened as he scanned the trees, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife at his belt. Max growled softly, a deep guttural sound that rumbled in his chest. Caleb's eyes narrowed, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just a deer or a bear in the distance. There was something else, something that made Max uneasy. "Stay close, Max," Caleb whispered, his voice steady but carrying a hint of tension. They stood there for a moment, the wind howling around them, before Caleb finally turned back toward the cabin. There was nothing to see, nothing to explain the unease that had settled in his gut. But as they walked back inside, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that this place, this quiet, empty cabin, wasn't as abandoned as it appeared. The snow continued to fall heavily outside, the landscape around Caleb's cabin shrouded in a veil of white. The trees, once towering and proud, now stood in stoic silence, their branches weighed down by the heavy snowfall. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, watching the quiet storm unfold. He had never been one to embrace the stillness of nature like some of his fellow soldiers, but here, in this cabin, the silence was overwhelming. It felt like something was missing, something important. Max, as if sensing his unease, had remained close, never straying far from Caleb's side. The dog's amber eyes flicked up to him occasionally, as if checking that Caleb was okay. But Caleb could feel the tension building in the air. The unease that Max had sensed earlier was now hanging over them like a shadow. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow, Caleb pulled himself away from the door and moved further into the cabin. He had hoped the cabin would be a refuge, a place to escape from the memories, from the guilt, from the world. But it felt more like a cage. The walls seemed to close in around him with every passing hour, and every creak of the old wood seemed to echo with the weight of his past. Max followed him, his paws silent on the wooden floors as he walked past Caleb, settling near the fireplace. The fire, small and flickering, was the only source of warmth in the otherwise cold room. Caleb knelt down beside Max, reaching out to stroke the dog's thick coat. The sensation of Max's fur beneath his fingers grounded him, if only for a moment. The cabin was old but solid. It had been built with care, each log carefully placed, each beam carefully carved. Caleb knew it had once been a place of warmth and life, but now it felt abandoned. The air smelled of dust, pine, and old wood, nothing like the bustling warmth of his childhood home, or the comforting scent of Sarah's perfume. It was a cold, sterile smell. Max lifted his head from his paws and let out a soft whine, pulling Caleb from his thoughts. The dog's eyes were focused on the door, his body tense as though he had heard something Caleb hadn't. Caleb's hand instinctively moved to the knife at his belt, a habit ingrained from his time in the military. "Easy, boy," Caleb muttered, trying to steady his breath. The unease that had gripped him since his arrival returned in full force. Max's sudden restlessness only confirmed what Caleb already knew. Something wasn't right. Caleb stood up slowly, moving towards the door. He glanced at Max, who was still fixated on the entrance, his ears forward, tail stiff. Caleb hesitated for a moment before reaching for the door handle. The cold air rushed in as he opened the door, and the wind howled, carrying with it the sound of the snow as it collided with the ground. The world outside was a blur of white, the snow swirling in the air like a dance of ghosts. Caleb squinted into the storm, but he saw nothing. No movement, no figures, nothing. It was as if the world had frozen in place, leaving him alone in the midst of it all. Max stepped forward, his paws crunching in the snow as he moved cautiously outside. Caleb followed closely behind, his boots sinking into the snow with each step. Max's body remained tense, and Caleb could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There was something about this place, something that Max had sensed from the moment they arrived. It wasn't just the stillness, it was the feeling of being watched. The further they ventured from the cabin, the more the silence seemed to close in around them. Caleb's breath came out in visible puffs, the cold biting at his skin. But it wasn't the cold that bothered him. It was the feeling that something was out there, just beyond his vision. Max suddenly stopped, his body rigid as he turned his head toward the forest. Caleb followed his gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. There, just at the edge of the trees, a shape moved. It was too far to make out clearly, but Caleb knew it wasn't just the wind or the trees shifting. Something, or someone, was out there. Max growled low in his throat, a deep rumble that Caleb felt in his chest. The dog's instincts were sharp, always had been. Caleb trusted them, even if he didn't fully understand what was happening. Whatever it wasn't friendly. "Max," Caleb whispered, his voice low. The growl deepened in response, and Caleb took a step closer, his hand tightening around the knife at his belt. The snow was thick here, and every movement felt like it could alert whatever was out there. Caleb's pulse quickened as he felt the presence of something unseen. Then suddenly a twig snapped in the distance, followed by another. Caleb froze, his heart thumping in his chest. Max's growl turned into a bark, sharp and demanding. Caleb's eyes darted toward the sound, but there was still nothing, just the shadowy figures of trees swaying in the wind. Max's body was tense, and his posture was solid, unyielding. Caleb knew that the dog wasn't afraid. He was prepared. Caleb wasn't sure what they were facing, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone here. The moment stretched on, each second stretching into what felt like hours. Caleb's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. There was no clear threat, no obvious danger, but Max's behavior told him otherwise. There was something, or someone out there, and Caleb wasn't going to wait to find out what it was. "Come on, Max," Caleb said softly, turning back toward the cabin. Max hesitated, his head turning back one last time toward the forest, before he followed Caleb, his body still alert. As they made their way back to the safety of the cabin, Caleb felt the weight of the silence settle once more, but it was different this time. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Max walked beside him, his movements steady but cautious, and Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that, whatever had been lurking out there in the snow, it wasn't finished with them yet. The storm raged on through the night, its howling winds carrying with them the biting cold that seeped into Caleb's bones. The cabin, though sturdy, seemed to groan under the pressure of the fierce gusts. Inside, the fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls, but it did little to dispel the tension that had taken root in the small space. Caleb sat in the corner, his back against the rough wood of the cabin, eyes fixed on the dying embers in the hearth. That Max lay beside him, his body tense, muscles coiled as if waiting for something to happen. Caleb had tried to shake off the feeling that had gripped him since he'd arrived, this sense that something was out there, watching, waiting. But no matter how many times he checked the windows or glanced at the door, there was nothing. Just the unrelenting snow and the cold. Yet, he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that the quiet was a lie. The mountain was silent, but not empty. Something or someone was out there. Max had sensed it too. The dog's heightened awareness was something Caleb had come to rely on in the past. They had been through more than their fair share of dangerous situations together. Combat, ambushes, long, sleepless nights in hostile territory. Max was always the first to sense when something was wrong. And tonight, his behavior had been nothing short of strange. The way he stood guard, the way his eyes never stopped scanning, the way he growled at nothing, everything about it felt wrong. "Easy, boy," Caleb muttered, but Max didn't respond. He never did. He was too focused on whatever he'd sensed outside. Caleb stood up slowly, stretching his stiff muscles. The cold had seeped into his limbs, and his knee, a reminder of his last tour, throbbed painfully. He limped over to the window, peering through the frosted glass at the world beyond. Nothing moved in the snow-covered forest. The wind bent the trees, but everything else was still. Caleb's fingers brushed the edges of his military knife, a constant companion since his days in the service. It was more than just a tool. It was a reminder of who he had been and what he had left behind. He hated that he carried it. But tonight, it felt necessary. The wind screamed outside, rattling the wooden walls. Caleb's gaze drifted back to Max. The dog was now sitting up, his head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. Max's amber eyes met Caleb's, and for a brief moment, Caleb could have sworn there was a flicker of understanding between them. Max wasn't afraid. He wasn't even uncertain. He was waiting. "Let's go," Caleb whispered, moving toward the door. He was tired of the waiting, the uncertainty. Whatever was out there, he needed to face it. Max stood up immediately, his body moving with purpose, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Caleb opened the door, and a wave of icy cold rushed in. The storm outside was relentless, the snow falling in thick, blinding sheets. Caleb couldn't see more than a few feet in front of him, but Max was already out, stepping carefully into the snow. Max paused at the edge of the cabin, sniffing the air, his body rigid. Caleb followed, his boots crunching in the snow as he stepped outside. The temperature was dropping fast, and the wind cut through his layers of clothing like a knife. But it wasn't the cold that made his skin crawl. It was the feeling of being watched. Max moved cautiously, leading the way as they walked toward the tree line. Caleb's breath came out in sharp puffs, visible in the frigid air. Every step felt heavy, the silence around them thick with the weight of something unseen. The forest was eerily still. The only sounds were the crunching of snow beneath their feet and the wind howling through the trees. Max stopped again, his head turning toward the woods, his body tense. Caleb halted beside him, eyes narrowing as he scanned the forest. His instincts, honed over years of military service, screamed that something was wrong. But the snow was too thick, the trees too dense to see anything clearly. Whatever was out there was good at staying hidden. The dog's body language shifted. Max was no longer just on alert. He was preparing for something. Caleb reached for his knife, his fingers brushing the worn leather handle, and readied himself. The feeling in his gut had shifted from unease to something else, something darker. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence. A soft rustling, followed by the crunch of snow underfoot. It was coming from further down the ridge. Caleb's heart raced as he turned toward the sound. Max growled low in his throat, his eyes fixed on the trees, his posture rigid. "Who's out there?" Caleb called, his voice cutting through the wind. The sound of his words seemed to vanish in the storm, swallowed by the swirling snow. Another crunch, closer now. Caleb's pulse quickened as he stepped forward, Max at his side. The dog's nose was to the ground, his senses working overtime to detect whatever was lurking in the storm. Caleb could feel the tension in the air, the way the wind seemed to hold its breath. The world was waiting for something. Then, as quickly as the noise had started, it stopped. A silence fell over the clearing, heavier than before. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. The air felt charged, thick with anticipation. Max's ears were forward, his eyes never leaving the trees. Without warning, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the snow just beyond the tree line. Caleb's heart skipped a beat as he squinted into the snowstorm, trying to make out the figure in the dim light. The figure was tall, dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured by a heavy scarf and goggles. They moved cautiously, almost as if they had expected to be spotted. Caleb's grip on his knife tightened, but he didn't make a move. He needed to know who they were first. "Who are you?" Caleb called again, this time louder, his voice carrying through the storm. The figure didn't respond at first, but slowly they lowered their scarf and goggles, revealing a weathered face with sharp features. A man, perhaps in his late 40s, with a grizzled beard and piercing blue eyes. His clothes were practical, layered, weatherproof, designed for the harsh conditions of the mountains. "I'm not here to hurt you," the man said, his voice steady but low, almost drowned out by the wind. "Just looking for shelter." Caleb remained silent for a moment, studying the man. He didn't know what to make of this encounter. Strangers didn't wander out here, especially not in a storm like this. But the man didn't seem threatening. Not yet. Max growled once more, a warning, but Caleb held up a hand to silence him. "You're miles from anywhere," Caleb said, his voice cold. "What's your business out here?" The man hesitated, then looked toward the cabin. "Lost," he said simply, "and cold." Caleb wasn't sure what to make of the man's response, but he nodded slowly. It was clear that the stranger was in need, and Caleb's instinct to help was fighting against his wariness. Max, however, wasn't convinced, and the dog's low growl continued to rumble in his chest. "Fine," Caleb said after a long pause, "but stay away from the house." "I'm not letting anyone inside," the stranger nodded, his breath visible in the cold air. "I understand." Max didn't stop growling, but Caleb motioned for him to stay silent as he took a few cautious steps toward the stranger. He wasn't sure if he was making the right decision, but something told him that this man, lost in the snow, wasn't the biggest threat out there. The storm continued to rage, but Caleb had a feeling the worst was still yet to come. The wind howled as it whipped through the trees, its icy fingers scratching against the walls of Caleb's cabin. Max had stopped growling, but his body remained tense, still watching the stranger warily. Caleb felt the unease settle in his chest as he stood just a few feet from the man. The man's appearance, weathered, rugged, and dressed in heavy layers designed to withstand the brutal cold, seemed to confirm what Caleb had initially suspected. This man wasn't from anywhere nearby. But the fact that he had appeared out of nowhere, in the midst of the storm, made Caleb nervous. Who was this man, and why was he out here? The stranger stood in the snow, still somewhat hunched against the wind, but there was a calm in his posture, as though he had weathered far worse conditions in his life. His face was a study of sharp angles, his beard full and untamed, with flecks of white that hinted at age and experience. His blue eyes, clear and piercing, scanned Caleb as if measuring him up, assessing whether he could trust him. There was a quiet intensity to his gaze, and despite the chill of the storm, Caleb felt a bead of sweat form on the back of his neck. "I'm not looking to cause trouble," the stranger finally said, his voice low and steady, as though he had said these words 1,000 times. "I've been traveling for days. I lost my way. The storm caught me off guard. I was hoping to find shelter, just for the night." Caleb didn't respond immediately, his gaze flicking to Max, whose posture was still tense. The dog seemed ready to leap at the slightest movement, a fact that did little to reassure Caleb. The man didn't seem threatening, but there was something about his presence that made Caleb uneasy. It could have been the isolation of the mountains, or the fact that Caleb had learned to trust his instincts after years of combat. But right now, Caleb wasn't sure he could trust this man. "What's your name?" Caleb asked, his voice rough from the cold. He kept his hand near the knife at his belt, just in case. The stranger paused, his brow furrowing for a brief moment before he answered, "Elias Ward. I'm a ranger, or I was a long time ago." The words caught Caleb off guard. A ranger? Well, what would a park ranger be doing out here, alone, in the middle of a storm like this? Something about Elias's presence didn't sit right with Caleb. He looked familiar, but Caleb couldn't place where he might have seen him before. "A ranger?" Caleb repeated, his tone skeptical. "You're a long way from any ranger station. What are you doing out here in the storm?" Elias's gaze shifted to the cabin, then back to Caleb. There was a flicker of something, guilt perhaps, or maybe just a weariness that came from years of solitude. "I've been tracking something," Elias said, his voice quieter now, as though he were reluctant to share more. "Something strange." Max's ears perked up at the sound of the word strange. The dog took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied Elias. "What do you mean, strange?" Caleb asked, his interest piqued despite himself. Elias didn't appear to be lying, but the vagueness of his answer only made Caleb more suspicious. Elias took a deep breath, his breath visible in the cold air. He looked out toward the trees, his eyes scanning the snow-covered forest as if he were searching for something. Or someone. There have been sightings. Something's been moving through these woods. Something not right. The words sent a chill down Caleb's spine. He wasn't sure if Elias was simply suffering from the cabin fever or if there was something more to his story. But there was a deep seriousness in Elias's eyes, something Caleb recognized from his time in the service. It was the look of someone who had seen things that couldn't be explained away by logic or reason. Something not right? Caleb repeated, his voice low. Like what? Elias hesitated, and for a moment it seemed like he was deciding whether or not to continue. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been tracking signs of movement. Something or someone has been using these mountains as cover. I've found traces, footprints in the snow, unusual disturbances in the trees, things that shouldn't be here. I thought it was just wildlife at first, but these tracks aren't right. They don't match anything I've seen before. Caleb felt his stomach tighten. And you think it's dangerous? I don't know, Elias admitted, his voice tinged with uncertainty. But I'm not taking any chances. Max took another step forward, now standing at Elias's side, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air around him. Caleb noticed the dog's unease. Max had been through too many situations to ignore his instincts, and right now, they were telling him something was wrong. Elias glanced down at Max, a flicker of something like recognition crossing his face. You've got a good dog there, he said. I can see why you trust him. Caleb didn't respond. Instead, he took a step back, his mind racing. This man, this Elias Ward, had appeared out of nowhere, in the middle of a storm, with a story about something strange moving through the Saste Mountains. Caleb had no way of knowing whether he was telling the truth, or if he was just another wanderer lost in the storm, but one thing was clear. Elias knew these mountains, and he had been out here long enough to be in tune with the land. You can stay the night, Caleb said, his voice firm but cautious. But I'm not letting you in the cabin. Max doesn't trust anyone he doesn't know, and neither do I. Elias nodded, as though he had expected this. I understand, he said quietly. I don't want to intrude. Caleb turned and began walking back toward the cabin, Max following closely behind, his body still tense. Elias fell into step beside him, keeping a respectful distance, his eyes constantly scanning the snow-covered forest. The wind howled again, louder this time, and Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was only the beginning of something much worse. The snow swirled around them, obscuring everything in its path, but still, there was no sign of whatever or whoever Elias had been tracking. When they reached the cabin, Caleb stopped. You can set up camp here, he said, motioning to a small sheltered area by the door. I'll bring you some food and water, but that's all I can offer. Elias nodded, settling into the makeshift camp Caleb had pointed to. He didn't argue, didn't push further. He simply accepted Caleb's terms. As Caleb entered the cabin, he glanced over his shoulder one last time at Elias, who was now unpacking a small bag. The man was alone, and yet Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't the only ones out here. The storm might be fierce, but it was the quiet that unsettled him the most, the silence that hung in the air, thick with the promise of something to come. Max walked over to the door, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air again. Caleb closed the door behind him, the lock clicking into place. Whatever was out there, Caleb knew it wasn't finished with them yet. The storm hadn't relented. The snow continued to fall in thick, swirling sheets, obscuring the world outside like a thick fog. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, casting dancing shadows across the room. Caleb sat near the hearth, his eyes flickering occasionally to the window, his mind restless. Max lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, but the dog's eyes never stopped moving. It was as if the storm outside had settled into the walls of the cabin, filling the space with a kind of oppressive energy that Caleb couldn't shake. Elias had settled into the small camp by the door, keeping his distance as promised. Caleb had given him some food, though the conversation between them had been sparse. Elias wasn't here to make small talk. He had a quiet intensity about him that made Caleb uneasy, something that reminded him of his own past when every moment felt like a ticking clock, waiting for the next mission. The night had passed without incident. The storm had only intensified, the wind howling like a living thing, but nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Elias's words still echoed in his mind. Something strange is out there, moving through the woods. Max's low growl interrupted Caleb's thoughts. The dog had stood up, his head lifted, his ears pricked, as if listening to something just outside the cabin. Caleb froze. He had learned long ago that Max's instincts were rarely wrong. "What is it, boy?" Caleb murmured, his voice low. Max didn't answer, of course. He never did. Instead, the German shepherd padded quietly to the door, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he had already decided what to do. Caleb rose to his feet, instinctively following the dog. His hand brushed the knife at his belt, his fingers cold from the steel. The unease that had settled into his chest since he had arrived grew stronger, heavier. "Easy, Max," Caleb whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to comfort the dog or himself. Max stood at the door, his nose twitching, sniffing the air. The wind howled outside, but there was something else, a sound, faint but unmistakable. Caleb's pulse quickened. It wasn't just the wind. There was something out there, something moving through the trees. Max growled again, a deep, low rumble that vibrated in Caleb's chest. Caleb moved to the door and slowly pulled it open, the cold air rushing in like a slap to the face. The world outside was a blur of white, the snow falling in thick sheets. But through the storm, Caleb saw movement, something, or someone, moving just beyond the tree line. Max didn't hesitate. He bolted outside, his paws sinking into the deep snow, and Caleb followed closely behind. The wind howled around them, but the air was still, the snow falling like a heavy curtain. Caleb's breath was visible in the cold, his chest rising and falling with the effort. His eyes scanned the trees, but everything seemed to blend into the white expanse. Max was ahead of him now, his body tense as he moved through the snow with a purpose. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest, his senses heightened, every instinct telling him that they weren't alone. The world felt eerily quiet, the storm's roar replaced by the soft crunch of snow beneath their feet. They reached the edge of the forest, and Max stopped, his body rigid. Caleb's hand instinctively moved to the knife at his side, though he didn't know what they were facing. Max's eyes were fixed on something in the distance, something Caleb couldn't see. The dog's tail was low, and his posture was stiff, his muscles coiled like a spring. "Max," Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. Max didn't look back at him. Instead, he took a few more steps forward, moving deeper into the forest. Caleb followed, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The trees were dense here, their branches heavy with snow, but Max seemed to know exactly where he was going. Caleb tried to keep up, but the thick snow made every step feel like a struggle. And then, suddenly, there was a sound, a rustling from the trees, followed by the snap of a branch underfoot. Caleb froze, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. Max was already moving again, his nose low to the ground, his body tense as he sniffed the air. Caleb's eyes darted around, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, but Max's behavior was becoming more erratic, his growls growing louder, more urgent. "Max," Caleb whispered, his heart racing. "What's out there?" The dog stopped and turned to face him, his eyes wide and alert. He was still growling, but it was softer now, almost as if he were trying to communicate something to Caleb. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the anticipation of something unknown. The sound of the wind had drowned out everything else, and Caleb had no idea how long they had been out there. Max's growl turned into a bark, sharp and insistent. Caleb tensed, his hand gripping the knife handle more tightly. There was something in the trees, something close. Then, without warning, a figure appeared from the shadows, stepping out from behind a large pine. Caleb's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the person, a tall figure, dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured by a scarf and goggles. They moved with purpose, their eyes hidden behind the dark lenses, but their presence was undeniable. "Who are you?" Caleb called out, his voice firm despite the tension in his chest. The figure didn't respond immediately, but they stopped just a few feet from Caleb, their breath visible in the cold air. Max barked again, this time louder, more insistent. The figure finally lowered their scarf and goggles, revealing a face that was familiar, but just barely. Caleb's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the man. "Elias?" Caleb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded slowly, his eyes meeting Caleb's. "You're still here?" Elias said, his voice low but steady. "I thought I'd find you." Caleb's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. Elias had been the ranger who had spoken of something strange moving through the woods, but why was he here now, standing in front of him like this? "What's going on?" Caleb asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. "What are you really tracking, Elias?" Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at Max, whose growling had ceased but whose stance remained alert. "I didn't expect you to be so cautious," Elias said with a wry smile, "but I'm glad you're paying attention." Caleb didn't know what to make of the man's words, but there was no time to waste. Whatever Elias was tracking, Caleb knew it was only a matter of time before the truth was revealed. The storm was relentless, but it was the tension between Caleb and Elias that felt more suffocating. Elias stood just a few feet away from Caleb, his face partially obscured by a scarf, his goggles pushed up onto his forehead. The wind howled around them, but neither man moved. Max stood at Caleb's side, his body stiff, his amber eyes locked onto Elias, his posture still tense. It was clear that the dog didn't trust the ranger, not yet anyway. Caleb's gaze flickered between Elias and the dark, snow-covered trees, still thick with the weight of the storm. He had let Elias in from the cold, but that didn't mean he trusted him. Something about this man didn't sit right with Caleb. The man had appeared out of nowhere, claiming to be tracking something strange in the mountains. But Caleb knew better than to take things at face value. A man like Elias, showing up out here in the middle of a snowstorm, didn't just happen to stumble across Caleb's cabin. "I didn't think I'd find you," Elias finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, measured, but there was an edge to it, like he was testing Caleb. "You've been here long enough. It's only a matter of time before you realize what's really out there." Caleb's chest tightened. "What do you mean? What's really out there?" His tone was sharp, but Elias didn't flinch. Elias took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing as if considering whether or not to share more. "I'm not sure yet. But there are signs, footprints, broken branches, disturbances in the snow. Whatever it is, it's been moving through these woods for days. I've been tracking it, trying to piece together what's happening." Caleb was silent for a moment, his mind racing. "You've been tracking it for days and you still don't know what it is?" Elias shrugged. "Sometimes it takes time to connect the dots. Whatever it is, it's been avoiding me. But it's getting closer." Caleb's thoughts raced. He could feel Max's tension beside him, the dog's muscles taut, ready to spring into action at the slightest provocation. Caleb wasn't sure what Elias was really after, but one thing was clear. He was hiding something. "If you're tracking it," Caleb said, his voice low, "why not just tell me what you think it is? What exactly are we dealing with?" Elias shifted, his posture changing as he looked at Caleb. "I'm not sure. But there's something about this place, something ancient. The mountain doesn't give up its secrets easily. People have been disappearing out here for years, especially in the winter. I think whatever it is, it's connected to that." Caleb's stomach clenched. "Disappearances?" Elias nodded. "Yes, people get lost. It's not uncommon in the mountains, especially during storms. But I've been keeping track of them, and they don't make sense. The patterns don't add up. It's like something is leading them off course, but it was manageable. Something is calling them. Faint yips and barks of the puppy shiver down Caleb's spine, and he couldn't help but smile. The idea of people being led away by a part of him, too, by some force more than just the animals he had rescued, wasn't a concept he was ready to entertain. But the more he thought about it, the more it seemed to make sense. The strange way Max had been acting, the sense of unease Caleb had felt since stepping foot in the cabin, the fact that something out there, in the midst of the storm, was watching them. Max let out a low growl, his head turning toward the forest. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. The dog's behavior was growing more erratic, and it wasn't just the storm. There was something out there. Caleb could feel it, deep in his gut. "You're sure it's not just animals?" Caleb asked, his voice tense. Elias shook his head. "No, it's something different, something deliberate. It's too intelligent. I've never seen anything like it." Caleb's mind reeled. He had been in war zones, in places where danger was everywhere. But this was different. There were no immediate threats, no obvious enemy, just the storm, the silence, and the growing sense that something was waiting. "I need to know more," Caleb said, his voice determined. "If something is out there, I'm not just going to sit here and wait for it to come to us." Elias looked at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I can take you further into the woods, but it's dangerous. You'll need to be prepared." Caleb didn't hesitate. "I'll be ready. Max and I, we've seen worse." Elias looked down at Max, who was still standing alert, his amber eyes never leaving him. The dog was listening, absorbing every word, his body poised like a coiled spring. Elias's gaze softened just a little before he spoke again. "You've got a good dog. I'll make sure we're both ready." Max's low growl rumbled through the air again, more persistent this time. Elias stiffened, his eyes scanning the snow-covered forest once more. Caleb's gaze followed his, but the trees were still. Nothing moved. The eerie quiet of the storm pressed down around them. "We'll need to go at first light," Elias said. "It's too dangerous to move out there now. The storm is still too strong. But tomorrow, we'll make a plan. We'll find whatever's out there." Caleb nodded, the weight of the decision settling on him. He wasn't sure what Elias was really after, or what kind of trouble they were walking into. But he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about survival anymore. Something was out there in the wilderness, and it had its sights set on them. As they turned back toward the cabin, the wind picked up again, howling through the trees like a wolf on the hunt. Caleb felt the weight of it press down on him, as if the storm itself was warning him to turn back. But there was no turning back now. Whatever Elias had been tracking, whatever had been haunting these mountains, it was coming. And Caleb was ready to face it, whatever it was. Inside the cabin, Caleb sat by the fire again, the warmth barely reaching through the cold that had settled into his bones. Max lay at his feet, his eyes never straying from the window, from the darkness beyond. Outside, the storm raged on, but Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that it was only the beginning of something much worse. The following morning dawned gray and cold, with the storm still relentless, but its intensity had waned slightly. The sky was a dull shade of white, heavy with the promise of more snow. Caleb and Elias stood near the cabin, preparing for the journey into the wilderness. Max, as always, was by Caleb's side, his eyes sharp and vigilant, scanning the landscape with an intensity that Caleb had come to rely on. The dog's presence was a constant reminder that, even in the midst of uncertainty, Caleb wasn't alone. Elias had packed light, just a small satchel with essentials, a map, a compass, a few rations. His movements were deliberate, as if he had done this many times before, and Caleb couldn't help but notice the ease with which he handled the cold, the snow. It wasn't just his survival instincts that made him an expert in this terrain. It was the quiet confidence that Caleb had come to recognize in seasoned men like Elias, men who knew how to survive when everything else was falling apart. As they stood in the cold, preparing to leave, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something they couldn't control. The unease that had been building since Max first alerted him to something in the woods had not dissipated. Instead, it had grown, and now it felt like a weight on his chest, a sense of impending danger that was so thick he could almost taste it. "You ready?" Elias asked, breaking Caleb's thoughts. Caleb nodded, his jaw tight. "As ready as I'll ever be." Max barked once, a sharp, urgent sound that broke the stillness of the morning. Elias looked down at the dog, his brow furrowed. "He's not fond of this, is he?" Caleb glanced at Max, who was standing on alert, his body tense, his ears pricked forward. "No," Caleb said quietly. "He's not, but he knows we're heading into something dangerous, something we don't understand yet." Elias looked at the trees beyond the cabin, his gaze narrowing. "Whatever it is, it's out there, and I've been tracking it for weeks. We're getting close." Caleb nodded again, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his side. He had learned long ago not to underestimate the power of intuition, and Max's instincts were rarely wrong. Whatever was out there, Caleb knew it was more than just an animal, more than just a storm. There was something else lurking in the woods, and it had been drawing them closer with each passing day. They began their trek into the forest, the snow beneath their boots muffled by the thick layer of powder that had fallen overnight. Max led the way, his nose to the ground, sniffing the air with a precision that Caleb admired. Elias walked beside Caleb, his eyes constantly darting to the trees, the tracks in the snow, the subtle signs of movement. The forest was eerily quiet. The only sounds were their footsteps and the occasional rustling of the wind. As they moved deeper into the woods, the trees grew denser and the air grew colder. The snow seemed to muffle every sound, making the world feel as if it were holding its breath. Caleb felt it, the unnatural stillness, the weight of the silence pressing down on him like a physical force. It was as if the forest itself were watching, waiting. Max stopped suddenly, his body stiffening, his head raised high. He was staring at something in the distance, his amber eyes locked onto the trees ahead. His growl was low at first, a soft rumble deep in his chest, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. The hairs on the back of Caleb's neck stood on end. "What is it, Max?" Caleb asked, his voice low. Elias tensed beside him, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his side. "Something's out there," he said quietly. "Stay alert." Max's growl deepened, his body rigid with tension. He took a step forward, then another, moving toward the trees with a precision that Caleb had come to recognize as the dog's instinct at work. Caleb followed closely behind, his eyes scanning the woods, his senses heightened. And then, as if the forest itself had suddenly exhaled, a figure emerged from the trees, a tall, shadowy figure, barely visible through the thick veil of snow. The figure moved with an eerie fluidity, as though it were gliding through the forest rather than walking. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting an animal, something familiar, something natural. But this wasn't right. The figure wasn't like anything Caleb had ever seen before. Max barked sharply, his tail raised high, his posture aggressive. The figure didn't stop, didn't react in any way. It just continued to move toward them, its movements unnaturally smooth, as if it were part of the very snow and trees that surrounded them. Caleb's pulse raced, his instinct screaming at him to run, to turn and flee back to the cabin. But there was no time. The figure was already too close. "Who are you?" Caleb called out, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to remain calm. The figure stopped. For a moment, everything was silent, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. And then, the figure spoke, its voice a deep, guttural sound that sent a chill down Caleb's spine. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice said, its tone cold and distant. Elias moved slightly in front of Caleb, his hand on the hilt of his knife, but he didn't draw it yet. He seemed to recognize the danger in the air, and Caleb could feel the weight of the moment press down on them both. Max continued to growl, but it was a softer growl now, one that was more out of confusion than aggression. The figure's eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto Caleb's. There was no warmth in them, no humanity, just an empty, unsettling void. "You're not supposed to be here," the figure repeated, its voice now a whisper, barely audible above the wind. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The figure didn't belong in the woods, and yet here it was, standing before them. It wasn't a man, it wasn't an animal, it was something else, something inhuman. Without warning, the figure took a step toward them, and Max barked again, this time loud and sharp. The dog lunged forward, his body tense and powerful, but before Caleb could react, the figure raised one hand. The air around them seemed to freeze, the wind stopping abruptly, the snow hanging in the air like a still image. Max stopped dead in his tracks, his body trembling with the force of whatever had stopped him. The dog's growl faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. Caleb felt his heart race as he looked at Elias, whose face had gone pale, his eyes wide with fear. "This is not a place for you," the figure said again, its voice low and dangerous. Caleb's mouth went dry. He didn't know what to do, what to say. He felt trapped, surrounded by the cold, the snow, and the overwhelming presence of something that was not human, something that was beyond his understanding. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure began to retreat, its movements slow and deliberate, disappearing into the thick trees. Max's growl resumed, but it was weaker now, as if the dog knew the figure was no longer a threat. Caleb stood frozen, unsure of what had just happened. The figure had disappeared, but the air around them still felt charged with an unnatural energy. Elias was the first to speak, his voice hoarse. "We need to get out of here. Now." Max barked once more, then ran back toward the cabin, his steps quick and sure. Caleb followed, his legs heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The snow continued to fall, but the world felt different now, as if it had shifted, as if something had changed that they couldn't fully understand. And Caleb, for the first time in a long time, felt truly afraid.